Hi, this is Peter from Being Filipino, and I'm going to do a historical video today that has to do with World War II, pre-World War II, right when World War II happened and when the Japanese came over and captured the Philippines and had the Philippines in control. And it has to do with treasure. So here we go. This is the first short story by Larry Eng. It's called The Lost Treasure of Corregidor. Every war has its allotment of secrets, and the secret of a fabulous wartime treasure is no exception. In the aftermath of the Pacific War, we've been tantalized by tales of Yamashita's legendary treasure, of Japanese ships that were laden with Asian loot that was sunk in Manila Bay, and of the fascinating gold Buddha that was described as a 3-foot-high statue made of pure gold, which had been retrieved from Manila Bay. No one has ever seen any of these treasures. Now, I beg to differ with that comment. There has been treasure that has been found here in the Philippines in many locations, and they were gold bars and other types of bullion that were hidden by the Japanese during World War II. And Filipino treasure seekers have found it. So that statement's not true. No one has ever seen any of those treasures. People have seen it and people have found it. But there is one exception, and that exception is not only verified, but it's actually audited. It's the lost treasure of Corregidor. In the final days of 1941, December 1941, were also the final days of freedom for Manila. As U.S. Army trucks and commandeered buses trundled north, filled with grim-faced American troops, Manila civilians no longer cheered and gave them the V for victory sign. On Christmas Day, news arrived that Hong Kong had fallen to the Japanese, and many people feared the same fate for Manila. The next day, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of USAFI forces, declared that Manila was an open city, which meant that the capital would be surrendered without a fight. The Shell oil storage tanks in Pandacan district were set alight, were set on fire, and with a tremendous blast, a great ball of flame roared into the sky with billowing black smoke. When the sun was blotted out, the city was bathed in a weird yellow glow. Those oil tanks would burn night and day for the next 5 days. It was an apocalyptic scene. As the Americans departed, their quartermaster corps warehouses were thrown open. At the foot of the Santa Ana Bridge in downtown, the insular ice plant and cold storage was stormed by people who carried away legs of ham, sides of frozen beef, frozen foods, dairy products, and all other types of foods that were imported from the United States of America. Serious looting occurred along Rizal Avenue, where window showcases were smashed and mobs grabbed dresses, shoes, handbags, and other retail goods. No policemen could be seen, as they had been ordered to destroy their guns for fear that they would be considered enemy combatants. Civic order had disintegrated into chaos. The United States Army opened its white warehouses in the port area, and the looting frenzies were repeated again. Chinese merchants parked their trucks nearby and offered to buy the looted goods. Deals were made on the spot, and the Chinese drove away with the loot to their own warehouses. You can only carry so much of the loot on foot, so the Chinese with the trucks were the real winners. A few streets away, the situation was more orderly. At the Manila Hotel boat landing, the Philippine Treasury gold, silver, and securities, as well as the valuable private holdings of panicky civilians, were gathered for transfer to Corregidor. It took 4 days, often interrupted by air raids, overseeing the load to the small fleet of boats was Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commander of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. He had come down from his room in the Manila Hotel and was able to bid goodbye to General Douglas MacArthur, his wife Jean, and their 4-year-old son Arthur, and his Chinese ama, Ah Chu, as they boarded the inter-island steamship Don Esteban for Corregidor. So at that point, the two men, Admiral Hart and General MacArthur, shook hands and said goodbye. Although they had known each other for decades, they were not close friends. In fact, the two men had often criticized each other acrimoniously. MacArthur blamed Admiral Hart for the lack of aggression because the U.S. Asiatic Fleet did not stop the Japanese landing in the Philippines. Hart, on the other hand, believed that MacArthur was incompetent and unable to defend the islands. In the last few days of peace, MacArthur had decided not to defend the beaches, but instead had reverted to War Plan Orange, which was a long-established plan to withdraw to Bataan Peninsula. In addition, MacArthur neglected to inform Hart of his decision to declare Manila an open city, leaving the U.S. Navy no time at all to retrieve torpedoes, spare parts, and supplies that had been stored in the capital. Hart pondered this lack of cooperation from the general. In his diary, he expressed his impression that MacArthur was catatonic. They didn't like each other. On December 27th, the flotilla of small boats, yachts, ships, and tugboats sailed across Manila Bay to Corregidor, bringing a vast hoard of treasure to the relative safety of the rock fortress. His task was completed. Admiral Hart boarded his flagship, the USS Helena, and sped south to rejoin his small fleet in the Dutch East Indies. 5 days later, General Masaharu Homa's 14th Imperial Japanese Army entered Manila. Barely 2 months after the eruption of hostilities in the Pacific War, Japan controlled the seas around the Philippines. Japanese armies walked ashore unopposed in Vigan, Lingayen, Atimonan, and Nasugbu. Now I'll stop here for a minute and I'll share a story with you. My mother-in-law, my wife and her family are from Atimonan. My father-in-law was a Chinese immigrant. He came from Xiamen in China in 1934 and arrived with his brother in Atimonan. He was young. He was like a teenager. And he worked on the docks and on the piers until he got old enough and started his own business in Atimonan and married my mother-in-law, Mama Rosita. And when they got married, Mama was 16, I believe, 16 years old, and Papa was 26. And they were there when the Japanese landed. And Mama told me some horrific stories of things that she witnessed when the Japanese came to Atimonan. I won't go into detail. It's too gory. There was some bad stuff that happened. And the Japanese were not very good. And my father-in-law actually had to go up. He went up and he shared this story with me. He went up into the mountains in Atimonan and he took this old man who was not able to take care of himself. So my father-in-law took him up into the mountains and they hid because they were Chinese. If they had been caught, they would have been conscripted into the Japanese army to do whatever. Who knows? So anyway, that's my family's side of the story, a little bit of the story from Atimonan when the Japanese arrived. My mother and father-in-law were there. Okay, so anyway, they arrived, the Japanese walked ashore, and to give you a little bit of history, the more weaponized and stronger troops were the ones that came into Manila, and then also down south, and up north in Vigan, and it says Nasugbu over on Nasugbu's over on the west coast of Luzon. Anyway, Atimonan, the troops that landed in Atimonan were not the Japanese premier troops. They were like some supply guys and stuff like that, but they weren't the best of the best anyway that went into Atimonan. So anyway, the Japanese army came in unopposed in Vigan, Lingayen, Atimonan, and Nasugbu. But they could not make use of Manila's strategic harbor, arguably the finest harbor in the Far East, because there were 4 heavily fortified islands that were held by the Americans, and that dominated in Manila Bay. The main stronghold of these islands was Corregidor, barely 3 miles wide, where General Douglas MacArthur had set up temporary headquarters. The ongoing battle for the Philippine Islands was being desperately fought in Bataan, which was one of the provinces that bordered Manila Bay. It is a peninsula that is separated from Corregidor by a 3-mile wide channel called the North Channel. In the total darkness of February 3rd, 1942, an American submarine, the USS Trout, surfaced in the North Channel just a few miles off from Corregidor. The submarine made a rendezvous with torpedo boat PT-41, which was a U.S. Navy vessel commanded by Lieutenant John Buckley. No, I'm sorry, that was Lieutenant John Bulkeley, who quickly climbed on board. He talked briefly with the captain, Frank Fenno. Bulkeley would guide the submarine through the minefields in the North Channel that provided part of Corregidor's defensive perimeter. A few minutes later, submarine Trout was following at high speed in the wake of the sleek PT-41 boat, which was propelled by 3 powerful Packard aircraft engines. Very soon, the submarine reached Corregidor's North Dock, and Lieutenant Bulkeley gunned his boat back to base at Sisiman Cove in Bataan. Lieutenant John Buckley became one of the most decorated officers in the U.S. Navy for his exploits in the defense of Bataan and Corregidor. Later, he and his torpedo boat squadron would be selected to spirit away General MacArthur, his family, and members of his staff from Corregidor to Mindanao, where they would be flown to Australia to continue to fight against the Japanese. So by 8 p.m. on February 3rd, the submarine Trout had reached the destination of its mission, which was to deliver 3,500 high-altitude anti-aircraft bombs to Fortress Corregidor. Army General Jonathan Wainwright urgently required this type of ammunition because all of the anti-aircraft guns on Corregidor, only one battery could fire beyond 24,000 feet altitude. Okay, so they had limited weapons. In the early days of almost daily raids on Corregidor, 13 enemy bombers had been shot down. But now the wary Japanese flew much higher than 24,000 feet. By midnight, all of the anti-aircraft ammunition had been offloaded from the Trout. But Captain Fenno noticed that his boat was now riding much higher in the water. He needed weight in the bilges to make the sub dive faster in case of enemy action. So he requested 25 tons of sandbags from Corregidor. The request was denied. Corregidor couldn't spare any sandbags or rocks, which were needed for its own protection. So someone suggested using gold for ballast. It seemed like a good idea. So the top Army brass and Treasury officials on the island were awakened for their approval. Very soon, Army trucks began shuttling from Malinta Tunnel down to the North Dock, bringing gold bullion and bags of silver specie to the Trout. Loading by hand started. but by 3 a.m. the hard work still wasn't completed and dawn was coming. Captain Fenno decided to submerge for the day and continue loading the following night. The crew of the Trout got a day off at the bottom of Manila Bay. In the evening of February 4th, a launch met the Trout and delivered the remaining cargo. The total transfer of wealth amounted to 320 bars of gold, 630 bags containing 630,000 silver pesos, and sacks of bearer bonds, treasury securities, and diplomatic mail. Excuse me. Before the submarine was escorted out to the open sea, Trout gave nearly all of her food and cigarettes to the launch for the distribution of the Corregidor garrison. That's nice. It was a noble but token gesture, for the men and the women on the besieged island numbered more than 10,000. Well, for the rest of her patrol, the crew and the officers of submarine Trout would dine mostly on spaghetti. Without meaning to diminish the daring of Captain Frank Fenno and his crew, who had showed plenty of character by penetrating the enemy's blockade, the rescue of part of the Philippines' national treasury was a victory, but only a small one. The submarine Trout had to leave behind in the vaults of the island an incredible fortune in gold and silver, as well as tons of jewelries and securities. The treasure comprised more than 51 tons of gold bullion. That's a lot. 32 tons of silver bullion, 140 tons of silver pesos and centavos, as well as civilian property consisting of around 2 tons of gold bullion in various size ingots, and lots of jewelry and precious gems, which were all transferred in a panic from Manila's 12 banks. The Philippine Treasury gold was comprised of standard size ingots. Each ingot weighed 44 pounds, and they were bound in bundles of 4. That's heavy. The shiny silver coins were packed in canvas bags, and they were stuffed into wooden crates measuring 14 inches by 14 inches by 24 inches. Each crate would hold 2 bags. The weight of each crate was 300 pounds. It's heavy. Every silver peso contained 0.05144 troy ounces of silver. That's not very much. And more than 15 million pieces of silver had been cataloged. That's a lot. It was unthinkable that this enormous amount of wealth could be allowed to fall into the hands of the advancing enemy. On Corregidor, the authorities faced a most difficult decision. When Bataan fell on April 9th to the Japanese onslaught, everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before Corregidor II would be forced to capitulate. Hundreds of millions of dollars in paper currencies and notes were disposed of by burning them in metal containers at the western entrance to Malinta Tunnel. Their serial numbers were recorded with the intention of reissuing those notes after the war's end. But the gold bullion and the silver specie were considered more difficult, if not impossible, to destroy. So the Americans decided to dump the treasure into Manila Bay, and they had to find a secret location for doing it very quickly. They decided on Caballo Bay. Viewed from above, the rocky island of Corregidor is often described as tadpole-shaped, and it is. The southern tip of the island has like a nice little curly tail on it. The tail end of the island is curved and terminates close to a medium-sized rock called Caballo Island. Within the curve of the tail is Caballo Bay. It's a short distance from South Dock in the South Channel between Corregidor and Cavite. Caballo Bay is deep, plunging 120 feet to a muddy bottom. that has occasional corals. This was the location that was chosen for the dumping. Over the span of 10 nights, 2 auxiliary U.S. Navy ships, the USS Harrison and the USS Pigeon, towed 2 flat-top barges crammed with gold ingots and boxes of silver coins from the south dock, to the dump site. By the light of a waxing full moon, they visually aligned the top of Corregidor with the peak of the darkness landmass of Bataan on the northern horizon. At a calculated distance from Caballo Island, they jettisoned the precious load, which quickly disappeared 20 fathoms into the moonlit water. This was backbreaking work using very rough navigation methods at best. By the end of April 1942, they managed to dispose of approximately 425 tons of silver coins and 2,222 gold ingots. So I'll stop here for a minute and I'll just show you, the coins, maybe some of the coins might have looked like this. Okay, so these are 1941 U.S. Filipino coins. Okay, I believe these are probably 10, 20 centavos, 5 centavos. These are all 5 centavo pieces. They date from 1938, 1931, 1926. They're old. Anyway, they're old. 1926, 1903. I've got some older than this, but there you go. Some 1903 U.S. Filipino coins. Okay, I don't know how much of them, how much silver there is in there, but anyway. So they disposed of 425 tons of silver coins and 2,222 tons of gold ingots. That's a lot. It was just in time because on the 5th of May, General Homa's assault troops boarded scores of small motorboats off Limay, Bataan, and headed south. The invasion of Corregidor had begun. Post-war records reveal that soon after their conquest of Corregidor, the Japanese learned of the sunken treasure. They organized a group of American and Filipino prisoners, and they made them dive for that treasure. The results were mixed. They were able to recover 365 boxes of silver, but no gold. The Japanese gave up shortly after that. Immediately after the end of the war, divers from the U.S. Navy 7th Fleet used metal detectors and dived into the site. Reports say that they salvaged substantial amounts of silver, perhaps 70% of it, but no gold. This gold was the real treasure of Corregidor. Where are the thousands of those gold bars? Have they been found? Or are they still lying on the bottom of Manila Bay? No one knows at this point, or perhaps somebody knows, but they're keeping it a secret. Manila Bay has many secrets, hundreds of secrets. Every secret has a story to tell, a unique story of its own. And the lost treasure of Corregidor is just one of those stories. And this was written by Larry Eng, who is a radio TV director for Grant Advertising International. And he was invited to join ABS-CBN sales here in the Philippines, after which he migrated to Australia just prior to the imposition of martial law. Following the downfall of Marcos, Jenny Lopez Jr. asked him to return to ABS-CBN as director for TV news and current affairs, which is a position that he held for 5 years before retiring. So anyway, that's the story of the, let me scroll back up to the top, the lost treasure of Corregidor. So I'll end it here. I will say this, that on today's Thursday here in the Philippines, I have to go to Manila tomorrow, and I'll be back. So I think on Saturday or Sunday, what I'm going to do is then share the story with you of the Great Manila Bay Silver Operation, which was exactly how the silver, the Japanese tried to recover the silver and the gold, and what the American POWs did to stop that. And it's quite a fascinating story, but it's about 40 minutes long, so I'll have to make a separate video. Anyway, a little bit of history here for you of the Philippines. And if you like this video, please subscribe and click like, punch that like button, and I'll have more to come, probably on Saturday or Sunday. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.